Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to House Human Services. Today is Thursday, February 20th, and we are picking up H91 this afternoon with Sarah Lunderville from the Vermont Center for Independent Living. Sarah, hi, welcome. Yes, please. And since you haven't been here, let's do a round of introductions around the room. I'm Ray Garofano. I represent Essex and Essex Junction.
I am Jubilee McGill. I represent Bridport, Middlebury, New Haven, and Cambridge. I'm Esme Cole. I represent Hartford.
I'm Zon Eastus, Guilford and Vernon. I think I've met you before.
The Arts Council?
Yeah,
Oh my gosh. It's a long time ago in my room, wasn't it?
Good afternoon. Audience, and I represent Golden Coast.
Me too.
Hello, I'm Doug Bishop. I represent Colchester's Chittenden 20 District.
Representative Steady, East Milton, and all of Westford.
Dan Noyes, represent Woolgate, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Bellevue. Good to see you.
Me too.
And in Berlin is
See?
all the way around the room.
Great. I'm Tori Moore with Pathways from Cheryl Deckins, also from Pathways. I'm Morgan Cross, the Executive Director of Public Refuge. Katie with the Legislative Council, Brenda Siegel, and Hopkins Vermont. Bethany Bogut, Vermont, the Childhood Advocacy Alliance. And Lori.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you for submitting your testimony, everyone. The testimony is on our website and you have the floor.
Okay, sorry it was so late to you all as well, but good afternoon. My name is Sarah Londerville. And I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Independent Living. VCL is a statewide organization or nonprofit. I'm so sorry. I'm going to start doing this now. Of people with disabilities working together for dignity, independence, and civil rights. Just a quick overview. I know there's a few new committee members. The majority of our staff and our board are people with disabilities, and we use that lived experience to support people in the community with disabilities and support them on goals of independence. And sometimes I stop and just say what independence is not like a place to live or independent living. That sort of language got co-opted over the 80s and 90s from us. But it's about being on our own, about being able to, as people with disabilities, to make our own choices and to have opportunity to work and live in the world. And we serve people with all different types of disabilities. So we do this through peer advocacy counseling, providing home modifications and assistive technology, managing a Meals on Wheels program for people under the age of 60 who have disabilities and can't make their own meals, and provide technical assistance and support to the business community around ADA and other disability-related laws. And we have lots of different programs, and you can check us out on our website. So over the past few years, VCL has taken a very serious interest in people experiencing homelessness. This especially became a focus when the governor made the announcement to end the public health emergency. What we found at VCIL is that while the public health emergency funding and policies had ended, many people have moved on from the pandemic. Our peers, people with disabilities in the state, were still and are still at higher risk. And they were caught within a system that no longer was helping them as a priority. Our peers are suffering, and we want to approach this offering as suggestions in which we think the programs can change to alleviate some of that suffering. I may boldly suggest that you ask others what their lens is when looking at these programs. Is it a program within a certain restrictive budget? A program that serves only some people? A program that has never fully been developed as one and has to work day to day, even though they might have offered suggestions to alleviate that suffering, if only they could speak freely about it and not take a side or a corner, or at least be honest about the lens right from the beginning. I, for years, thought that everyone comes to the table because we care and want to serve the people screaming for help, but have come to realize that bias plays a large role and we're not all on the same page. So having said that, my bias and lens and expertise is around supporting people with disabilities. I'm sitting before you with a moving forward spirit, excited for creation of something that benefits and protects people. I worked a bit with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was set up by our legislature to look deeply into the harms we've created as a system. Sometimes those harms were created intentionally, like our eugenics movement, And sometimes those harms were created from a place of where we're just trying to help. I see that all the time. A great example was when the flooding happened in 2023 and systems were set up mostly by able-bodied people who were just trying to help in an emergency and would leave people with disabilities and their experiences right out of the conversation and set up systems of volunteers that were, quote, just trying to help, but didn't know the first thing about supporting people with disabilities. And it actually did create harm and still is. We have a great opportunity here, and I appreciate the work of all of you who continue to engage while at the same time are dealing with drinking from the fire hose of the state of emergency we are all living in. I also want to share our support for an advisory board comprised of people with lived experience and also caution some of our experiences with some committees to help with the pitfalls of unintended consequences when we set up boards like that. I appreciate the committee asking for a report from a task force and included our organization in that task force. I believe that it made it possible to get to the heart of some of the existing structural issues. It's disappointing to me that the department's letter to this committee makes it seem like the people with lived experience and advocates approach doesn't consider the financial constraints of the state. I followed some of the committee, and our representative on the task force was Brenda Siegel, and she reported back. And I think the task force did exactly what they were asked to do within the constraints of what they were offered. And I think that they really did a good, incredible job with a huge task and a strong diversity of voices. When I'm looking into program development, I start with the actual needs and build from there. What are the issues and how can we address them? And instead of coming to the table with an approach of working together, there is a dissertation to every recommendation that involved more analysis and an attitude that it can't be done because of funding. And that is an approach that hinders in evolving into something that works for people when they are needing support more than ever. I can tell you how it's affecting our programmatic work at VCIL. More and more individuals who are experiencing homelessness are seeking support from our peer counseling team. What has taken the most time and support is every time there is a change to the program, but not adequate and plain language information to peers. And without the support of us and in turn partners we found through this work in End Homelessness Vermont and Pathways Vermont, these people would have been left on the street. There have been multiple transitions in which End Homelessness Vermont literally had to be the nearly sole communicator with people in hotels and where they have had to work every day at night to help people jump through several hurdles. It does seem that there's a lack of understanding of disability from people around people experiencing homelessness. Examples like prioritization, making people redo a disability variance form every year. Those things have made providers and people with disabilities spend so much time trying to constantly meet higher and higher hurdles and lose their shelter as a result. The people come to us because they have no other support, and I'm sure you've heard in testimony, don't feel supported by these existing systems. When I hear of a staff who is running up the state to help people who are hard of hearing or deaf be able to meet a deadline to pay their income contribution because they couldn't talk to the person in the hotel and didn't have a way to actually have that communication solved, or explain the newest rule that is a waste of our resources. VCL staff are there to support independence, and we've basically become an extension of what this program should actually be doing. But it wasn't really built as a program, and that's the issue in which where we sit, right? When building programs, we need to think on all the levels of protections. It's got to be baked in, and it's got to be what the recommendations have done. And until that mess is cleared up, we need to start harming the participants. We can't have them jumping through unnecessary hoops just because we don't have a clear path for them. It creates more chaos, and for our peers who have disabilities, an absolute roadblock that good programs have responsibilities to deal with. There are laws that are being broken right now. The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically, and all the systems work needs to ensure that we're not creating more chaos for individuals. Now, I work with people with disabilities, but care about all the people experiencing homelessness. And I wouldn't want to say that one, quote, category is more important than another. But I do find it upsetting when prioritizing that people with disabilities seem to not end up on the list. And I have to wonder if it's because it's just easier to discard that population overall because they don't have the same resources or bandwidth to keep up with ever-changing rules and understand what the rules mean. We need to be thoughtful from start to finish and including the evaluation stage of how this helps support someone in crisis. And it must be done in a parallel action, right? Like as this continues to be worked on and strengthened, we can't pull the people experiencing homelessness into that push and pull of that system change again. We need to pause changes so that people remain sheltered until they are permanently housed. Programmatic structure is in place. We can't allow what's happened last fall to happen all over again. We know firsthand how the changes over the past few years have affected our ability to support individuals in this community. Our capacity to continue to support is so thin right now, like I could cry, honestly, on record. And while we try so hard with our very small statewide staff, we know that sometimes that support is the actual lifeline of an individual, including people released from a hospital with a new amputation, people with developmental disabilities and deaf not understanding the programmatic language, or staff trying to keep up with these changing rules. We've had an interest in the definition of disability. Some of you have heard me testify on this many times, and we continue to support language that comes in line with the federal definition of disability that is widely known and accepted under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which passed in 1990. Getting to that program assessment of verification, we continue to believe that there are ways to do this and not create large barriers for individuals. We support the recommendations of the task force. There is language in the recommendations regarding complying with the Olmstead decision. So I'm guessing that you know, but it was a legal decision upholding the integration mandate of the Americans with Disabilities Act, basically saying that people with disabilities should be able to live in the least restrictive environment if they choose. So if we're offering a program around shelter systems and we start to put people with disabilities in more restrictive environments like nursing homes or other institutions, just because they have a disability, not because they want to, if they choose, that's different. But just because of a disability, that becomes a violation of the ADA and the Olmstead decision. It's about options and choice. So as we are developing alternative options, that needs to be really at the forefront of the discussions and decision-making. And I would add to this that any consideration of a specialized shelter, it is critical that we're not siloing one population from another. That does have remnants of asylums and institutions. Removing people with complex needs and living with disabilities from the general population is indeed a slippery slope. I recommend the focus be on supportive and permanent housing with a robust access to services and some beds set aside for the specific need, but not entire isolating shelters. That carries big risk in going back in the wrong direction. One recommendation that would be something to put in place sooner rather than later would help us in supporting individuals in the community is around information sharing and communication. VCL staff spend a good amount of our time working to help individuals understand their rights and responsibilities. The recommendations around clearly defining and having plain language in determination notices, the application process, the process for asking for a reasonable accommodation, which by law cannot be denied because of the way someone has not perfectly asked for that accommodation, as you heard from legal aid this morning, in the appeals process. Providing details and information in writing to all households, including issuing denial letters when someone has been denied, and including the reason for denial, instructions on appeal process and contact information for legal services and other organizations who can support them through that appeal. There's only one other organization, to my knowledge, that offers that type of support to people who are not currently their clients. So offering these resources shouldn't be a huge administrative burden. And having different options for applying allows people to make sure that people know what resources are available to them is critical to them in getting the support that they need. We need to agree we also agree with the recommendations of robust data collection so that we can create and continue to move in the right direction of supporting individuals. The reporting requirements recommended by the task force are important to help us understand. The department has said in a report that they have a hard time collecting certain data, and I think looking to partners who have developed relationships with the participants by supporting them holistically, not just as in this emergency program, might allow us to get to some of that information too. And some partners are already doing that, and it's just not funded. We believe that the housing first models for housing and principles for shelter, as well as coordinated entry, are important to the success of individuals moving from emergency shelter programs to permanent housing. And there are many people working to support people in the community. And for VCIL, we have relied heavily on End Homelessness Vermont in essentially a role as an ombudsman, supporting our staff and working together to support individuals. Without that support, we know that eligible applicants would not have received the support that they should have. That's what's pretty heartbreaking, that we know that there are people that would have gone, that would have and did lose shelter until someone advocated and got the right information to help them stay sheltered. That's not programming to be proud of. We believe that the ombudsman role needs to become an essential part of the infrastructure to help support individuals and also report back to the legislature and ensure that we are being accountable to the systems being developed. We know that a housing first model and the work of Pathways Vermont is critical in this overall and in our partnerships. And we would like to be able to refer to them more, but they are limited and need robust and statewide funding. We will continue to provide service and support in a peer-to-peer support role, but like other organizations, our funding is at risk as much of it comes from our federal government. These are the specific recommendations. I think I've talked about them a little bit already, but I'm going to tell you some of them that we have from VCL. We support the task force recommendations and specifically want to highlight the need to have no room or day caps, as this is extremely harmful and causes pressure and chaos on our systems, and most importantly, for people experiencing homelessness. Use the task force recommendation and the ADA's definition of disability and language of requirements around reasonable accommodations that you heard from Legal Aid today. And I appreciate the many options that the task force created for proving disability. This has been something that we've been talking about for a very long time. We have found that the disability variance form to be the most accessible option at this point, but a variety of options is really good for our community as a whole. And that statutory language be added that requires reasonable accommodations be considered. I've included 2 recommendations and I'll send them. I don't actually know if I actually sent them earlier today that are represented in the task force did present, but there was not really a lot of time to fully consider. And in the interest of time, I'll send them over. One is already in the rules, but it's not being followed. And the second is clarifying language for reasonable accommodation. And I think we need to put to rest these extra barriers that people with disabilities and work required of providers around the whole accommodation request. It's pretty straightforward. We do this in lots of different systems, and I just don't understand why in this system it's such a big lift. In any specialty shelter discussion, to ensure that these are mixed populations and include choice for people living with disabilities, being careful not to create isolating or forced quasi-institutional environments, and using that housing first model to ensure that people do not become unsheltered, offering robustly available but not required services. I'm really grateful that this committee continues to take on this issue. I think it's very important. I just kind of going off script for a second. It took a lot of time to write, but like this is something that BCIL was not focused on, as I said, until a few years ago. And so I'm not the expert on some of these things, but we've become way more experts than we ever thought that we would be, because there's so many people with disabilities that are experiencing homeless right now. And it's pretty unimaginable how that's gotten to this place. So just really appreciate your time and energy and continued support of this issue. Thank you. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you so much. I am always grateful for your work and that you remain a resource and an organization available to Vermonters with disabilities. I am wondering, I have a bill around establishing peer support positions for housing stability that
Okay.
we might blend it into this. And so I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what that looks like. I'm going to ask Pathways as well.
Sure.
You know,
Let's talk
what
about
the benefits been to both the people kind of receiving that peer support,
Okay.
but also I know it can be really beneficial for the people who are acting kind of as the support person. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So VCL started in 1979, and part of what was baked into sort of the disability rights movement as a whole is that peer-on-peer support. And so we have been doing that. It started really supporting people with physical disabilities with other physical disabilities, but pretty quickly in the early 80s, that shifted to be cross disability. And so what that does is, take from our lived experience. Like I always use my personal experience, it's just easier. I I was put in mental hospitals and institutions a lot. But that was an awful experience. And I shared with the committee in the past about what those experiences were like. But I have a lived experience that not everybody has because of those experiences. And I'm able to share with somebody who's struggling around those type of experiences because of that lived experience. And I get something from that person who's my peer, and that peer gets something. And hopefully they get to learn how to take sort of individual issues that they have and look at the system as a whole, that maybe we shouldn't be locking people up in institutions and that sort of thing. So that's just one tiny sliver of an example. So I didn't know that you had a bill, so I'm happy to read that, but I can see that playing out really well within housing as a whole, not only accessing housing, but like I lived in subsidized housing for a bit. This is in a time where I wasn't able to work and was on benefits. And when I lived in housing, it was very difficult to sort of navigate because I was the youngest person with a disability. I moved into housing when it was all elders. And so I'm a little bit older now. And there was no people with disabilities that had ever lived there before. And so I didn't know it, but I was being discriminated on a pretty regular basis by these elders who were really angry that I was living in their housing, and they didn't see me as a person with disability because you can't tell I have a disability and all that sort of stuff. And so there was a lot of learning. The Barrie Housing Authority was amazing in terms of like trying to hold trainings and help people understand. But if I was able to talk to a peer at that time, like, oh God, I experienced that too, and here's how I navigated that system, then that would have been really helpful at the time. So I think that that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your relationship and collaboration with Dale,
Okay.
and kind of understand, like having them help maybe identify some resources that are available for folks that are exiting or in the hotel motel program.
I haven't had a lot of conversations or interactions with, I mean, we work with Dale on a regular basis. That's no shade on them. We receive, we work in partnership with them on a lot of different things. We receive money for our Meals on Wheels program, but we haven't had interactions in terms of, honestly, when people were struggling the most, I saw Brenda do a Facebook post and I reached out to her and said, I need help. And so that's really been our biggest resource and help in terms of like trying to help people on the ground. And understand, because I didn't understand the system whatsoever at the time. And so that, and yeah, I haven't had any like strong connection with Dale around this issue, unfortunately. Yeah, but I haven't reached out either. It's not it's not a criticism of them.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
So I went in your testimony, thank you for this. You talked about information sharing and the need for better,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
just reasonable information sharing
Yeah.
and communication. You mentioned that I think you said something like there's one of the organizations that you can think that does.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know
Yeah.
what that is, and
Yeah.
would you call it a model, or you're just
Mm.
aware that it's
Yeah,
there?
yeah, yeah. So again, and Homelessness Vermont is where we reached out to because I didn't know how to do this. And so we brought them in to talk with our peer advocates counseling team to help them understand the forms and the paperwork and that sort of thing, because it wasn't intuitive for us. And we do a lot of systems work as an organization, but some of the stuff, like you would do it and then we were being met with barriers. And I'm talking like starting like 3 years ago when things were really in stronger crisis. And so we weren't, and through time though, I've come to learn, oh, this is how you ask for an accommodation. And that's what that paperwork looks like. And here's how you do the determination. And that's what that looks like. And I think there's so much simpler ways to do some of the work that is being done. And I think it's absolutely the responsibility of the state to do that work, to have information that's on their website or in paper form or whatever form, or even on the phone, to have that dialogue and be able to share with somebody. We talk about plain language being at like a 4th grade reading level where people understand this is what I'm signing. This is what I'm responsible to go and pay this by a certain date or whatever those things are. And having that back and forth. And we found that wasn't happening at that time. Yeah.
Question?
As first, okay. Great. So you also, I just wanted to get more information. You talked about the advisory board.
Yeah.
And when I
Yeah.
pitched it to last year, this bill H91 is just, I put it in, it's exactly what passed out of the House last biennium. And so we expect lots of changes, but the advisory board part, I pitched that because I too am
Yeah.
someone with lived experience of disabilities and homelessness. And I know that being kind of the token person on a task force where there's one or two can be really challenging, and feel really uncomfortable. And it's really hard to participate in a meaningful way. And so we thought an advisory board where it's more of a peer affinity group would be a better approach. And so I'm really would love to hear like
Yeah.
what you know, you
Yeah,
said you have some caution
Oh,
or
yeah.
if you want to
I
submit
should have
that.
said it. It wasn't, no, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
that big of a deal.
I want to make sure we do it right.
No, no, no.
Value.
It's sort of like just a thought I had, and I probably shouldn't have put it that way in my testimony, but I do have a little bit of a caution based on, so as long as so what you're describing is exactly what I think is wonderful, because I watch, even with the task force, so here's an example, and I don't mean to throw people under the bus, honestly, in this situation, but I'm going to a little bit. I watched the task force happen from a Zoom meeting. And the moment that the person with lived experience started talking, the person from the state started looking at her phone and walked out of the room. And I felt so sad for that person with lived experience, this homeless person who was sitting there sharing their experiences. And that's what people experience all the time. Like, it was okay when it was all the professionals were sharing, the person was listening or sort of listening. And the second the person with lived experience started sharing, and it could have been an emergency, whatever, but that's what it felt like to me. So having ways that advisory can be truly advisory, where there's not like this power dynamic or struggle, like to look at that. The reason I said in my testimony, like, to be cautious is I've been part of a couple of things the legislature has passed in recent history around trying to make it really, really separate, so that those groups could be more autonomous. And in doing that, it leaves out, I'll just give you the examples. It was like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process, that sort of thing. You want to have a separate process so that there's not like something coming from a different power level. But in doing that, there was nobody administratively to go to for accommodation requests, or like, how do you go through the process to actually participate in the meeting? So that was my only caution. It wasn't like a big thing. And I think that the way you're describing it is probably within a system already so that people can go and, work. But I work on, we have a lot of it in the disability community. A lot of the federal government stuff that got set up back in the 60s and 70s made it so that there's lots of advisory boards where people with disabilities, like even my own organization, has to have 51% or more people with disabilities in leadership positions, that sort of thing. I think it's a really powerful way, because how are you going to get that specific lived experience? And when you're talking with other people who have it, it kind of helps, move it forward.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Of course. It's not too much.
All right, so we have Cheryl next.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Oh my gosh, thank you.
Share this, it's on the website. Thank you. Any copies of anybody would like to.
Yeah.
Stretch.
I do. I mean, I pulled it up, but yeah, I like the thing.
Thanks.
It's just isn't gonna pronounce it.
I stole all my comments.
You don't have any. Oh, it's here. I got it up. I got it up right here. Can share. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting us. Phillips just for her work and for setting me up with like pathways, right? Here I am. Yes, I want to share with you all a little bit about what Pathways is doing to address homelessness in Vermont, which is the Housing First permanent supportive housing. So there's a lot of information on this sheet. Many of you have probably seen it, but some things to highlight is we are working in 8 counties throughout the state, where we have a team. We're serving, it's like 30 to 40 folks on each of those teams. So roughly 300 statewide. The numbers, they're pretty fluid, but, and that is a permanent supportive housing model. We don't own any real estate, so we're working with the voucher system as well through the Vermont State Housing Authority. I think was here earlier this week. And we are working with landlords, so we're doing a lot of like landlord liaison work, and then working with the housing authority and pairing those two with our service team. So we have teams in each county, and those folks are visiting folks in their homes, visiting wherever they are really. So we're serving people when they're homeless and bringing them into housing. And from the day we meet them, we're meeting them where they're at. So sometimes that's on the bench. Hopefully it's in their homes, and then we stay with them throughout, or they can be in the program for as long as they wish. It's permanent. So there's a couple things I would highlight here. If you look at like these bubbles here, where when we first got started, we were operating on a grant. And so they had a discrete group of people that they were able to follow for a period of time. So the 6 months prior to being in the program are the big bubbles of what the costs were for just different sort of institutionalized settings. The smaller bubbles are what it looked like for that same discrete group of people 6 months after becoming part of the program. So like the dollars are shocking, right? And similarly, on the flip side, there's a little bar graph here that has like daily rates of these, I think, are numbers from 2021. So the numbers themselves are lower, but the comparison remains the same. The numbers will just be higher and therefore more shocking. But you can see, a hotel, our services were roughly $60 a day. A hotel is getting on 150 and so on. So just really like the economic efficacy of the program. Another data point I would highlight is that the housing retention in permanent supportive housing in Housing First is about 85%, and that has held for a decade, for more than that, really. And that's true for other Housing First programs. There are a few others in the country. There are some others internationally, but that's a pretty like static number, actually, that 85% retention rate. Yeah, are there questions in particular that you all have for me?
Just need a review question.
Sure.
You said at the beginning while we were shuffling papers.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I heard it. There are 8 agencies in the state and you're holding about how many clients? You said around 300?
About that, yeah. So it's 8, in 8 counties, I have what we call an ACT team and a assertive community treatment team. So I have 8 of those in 8 counties
Okay.
throughout the state.
And so how, can you describe the process of how a person gets into this?
Sure. We work through the coordinated entry system.
Uh-huh.
And we're obligated to do that by, through HUD, through the system of care. But so when we have capacity on any one of our teams, we're participating at the coordinated entry meetings that happen in each county. And then also the continuum of care meetings that are happening, or some people call them housing solutions, I think is the new name for that. But, so we're going to those tables and I might say, okay, in Brattleboro, I have room for 2. And the coordinated entry system does what they do, which is like go through their list and their prioritization process. And they give me kind of the next person up. And that's happening in each of those 8 communities that we're working in.
Tara, what's the number of cases per like supportive housing case coordinator or however you want to, case manager?
For employees?
Yeah, like the person you have that is like the case manager.
Yeah, so we have, most of our teams are like 3 team members, a couple of them are 4. Generally, the ratio we would like is 1 to 12. The ratio we really have is 1 to 15, sometimes 18.
So 12 to 15 is
Yeah,
ideal.
yeah. And we kind of shy away from the case management language.
Yeah, I know.
yeah.
I was just in another meeting and there's just so many.
It's a thing that means something to people, right? So
Yeah,
we still
it
use
means
it.
different things to
Yeah.
different people.
What we do is what we call a shared caseload model. So if I have 3 employees on an ACT team who are serving, say, 35 to 40 people in their community, all 3 of those people are seeing all 35 of those people, right? So like,
Case management,
I like-
or like just one person on a person, essentially?
no, actually the opposite, right? So
That's what yours means, though. Yeah, sorry.
No, so mine means that like everyone on the team is seeing everyone on the list rather than like, you have a list of 10, I have a list of 10. Yeah.
Can you tell, I have an idea of why you do that. Can you talk a little bit and tell us a
yeah,
little
I mean,
bit
I think-
about the ACT model?
So shared case management addresses a lot of things. Community integration, right? That person now knows more people in their community. They know 3 people instead of just 1. It addresses choice. Like we want folks to be, these are just some of like our agency values, community integration and choice. They can choose if maybe they don't like me and they want to see you instead, or maybe like I'm good at budgeting and you're good at cooking. I don't know, some more choices. And also really addressing burnout is another piece of whether both for our staff and the other folks. I don't know,
maybe you don't want to keep having me knock on your door every week and you want somebody else to show up, you know? So those are some of the like the basic
Is there
reasons.
standard set of like services, for lack of a better word, that your organization provides to people that like, is there, you know, housing navigation and referral and connect, like, do you have like a set list of things, or is it whatever the person is?
It is, yeah, it is. So it is by individual choice. Obviously, we're doing housing navigation, housing first, right? So I mean, that just kind of has to happen. And then what is often called housing retention in the, you know, in the system, if you will. Kind of everything else we do is that, right? How do you be a good neighbor? How do you keep the terms of your lease? How do you generate an income? How do you know, all those things, right? Kind of for us fall in that bucket of housing retention. And it does look different for each individual based on what they're choosing. And so everyone has what we call a service plan. So we are actually setting out goals and objectives and you know, documenting and marking as we go. And they might be specific to housing, but they might be, you know, I want to get a driver's license, I want to get a job, it could be anything.
I
So
think you mentioned this already, but is there a time limit of,
there's not, so it's
okay,
square housing, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Just looking at here, the top piece, investment in 957,100
Yes.
would enable pathways to build. And then in the next blocks, this funding would support 85 households. For people to be able to qualify for that, do they need to be under the supervision of the Department of Corrections? The only reason I'm asking that question is because obviously down here at the bottom, having Rutland County with our partnership with DOC. So is there a,
They would not. So right now in Rutland, the only service we're providing in Rutland is through our Department of Corrections partnership. So this dollar ask that we're talking about here would be to expand that to offer housing first services to the community.
That's one of the, I mean, separate issue, but that's one
Yes.
of the, in, Representative Coles and I's budget areas. That's one of the kind of the recommendations on
So
the
it's to
table.
expand it beyond the.
Correct.
Beyond the
DOC population.
So then it would go to
Then
that.
other.
The coordinated entry system and those, so like
Mhm.
any community member, as they participate with that system, can access the service. Whereas right now in Rutland, only folks that are referred through the Department of Corrections can access it, and it's not permanent.
yeah. And I just want to also comment, I'm a big fan of the Acceptance Commitment Therapy Act. Acceptance
Oh, yeah.
Commitment Therapy, I
Yeah.
think it's one of the most practical CBT approaches to take with individuals that are residing in these levels of services. So it's good to hear a
Right?
little bit of the insight and how that's working out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So with the desire to expand past the DOC relationship in Rutland County, should you do that and be able to work with more families, how would you work with or in parallel with Brock and supports that they're providing?
Yeah, so Brock, I mean, we work in parallel with like really all the community action agencies. Brock is also in Bennington, which is the
Right.
community that we're in. So what that looks like really is we're going to community action maybe for HOP grants when folks need support with back rent or security deposits, repairs. We might be going to community action for like some landlord liaison support or even some dollars. Sometimes, not always, there are dollars through community action that support landlords. So we want to nurture our landlord relationships. And so we might help get them through those kinds of applications and systems. If they're going to build like an ADU or something like that. So yeah, we definitely consider them one of our community partners. I don't know that Brock does it, but many of the community actions do a renters course, which is something that we utilize a lot because a lot of folks are coming without good landlord references. So that's a way that we start to build that up, is doing the renters courses. So yeah.
If I could
Go ahead.
follow up and please excuse my learning curve I've been on for the last 7 weeks. How do the services, we'll take another county, Bennington County, where Brock also is located and serves people. How are the services when helping someone trying to get out of homelessness? How are they similar and how are they different from what you might provide and what Brock might provide?
The housing, really. Yeah, I think each community action throughout the state maybe has access to a little bit of different programming, but in general, they're mostly the same. So I'm not familiar with if Brock is doing any housing work right now. They may be, but I'm just not familiar with it. So that it could be that there's some similarities, but mostly they're doing things like the food shelf and the HOP grant money. They do a lot of like financial support for folks. Is it more like community-based rather than housing-based?
Thank you.
Sure.
Questions?
This is very basic, and I'm sorry, I'm also on the learning curve. So the authority that you work under, are you under the state government in any way, or are you just receiving funds? From
Just
the state?
receiving funds,
Okay,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
you're essentially, it's a national nonprofit organization?
We're not national, we're just in Vermont.
Just Vermont.
Although, Maria, correct me if I'm wrong, we are we're a specialized services agency. So actually, like, your question about under the state, that is an AHS, right? Is that true? So we are,
Okay, so there is,
are you familiar with the term DA, like a designated
Yeah,
agency?
no,
So it's similar but smaller.
yes,
where
I've
that's-
heard of that.
Yeah.
yes, trying to get it all. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Go by. And I asked this of Sarah, but again, I just was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you use peer support in your work.
So
And the benefits and
yeah, we are like, kind of consider ourselves a peer support agency. Not everyone that works for us is a peer necessarily, but it's a question on our application. It is definitely we ask everyone about, we value lived experience. We consider it an asset. What are your feelings about that? And that is true. Like, we value it. We consider an asset. We want to bring it in to our team. And I think, Sarah who said it probably as well as I could, but there's no replacement for having been there. Right. And it takes away that power dynamic of us versus them, or, even when she gave the example of the person kind of like getting distracted, that's not going to happen in a peer relationship, right? You're really going to be sharing that power and having good connection, good understanding with one another in a way that is very hard to replicate otherwise.
Is peer support volunteer, so we're now adding more costs onto the administrative level?
So for us, I know there's like peer support, capital P, capital S. We're kind of like not capital P, capital S. And so, but that's a focus when we hire. So folks they're just working the job that they have, right? Yeah.
I like to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
testimony.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here. Maybe we have witnesses at 2, so you have